The town of Dry Gulch wasn't the kind of place you'd find on any map worth a damn. Just a sun-baked stretch of dirt with a sign hanging crooked on a rusted nail, like the whole damn town couldn't be bothered to stand straight. The heat here didn't just sit it pressed down like a boot heel on your throat. And walking down that lone, dusty road was a woman who'd forgotten what tears felt like. Her name was Eleanor Vance, though most folks wouldn't dare call her anything but that Vance girl. At 26, she carried the weight of a life harder than the rocks under her feet. Her eyes held the kind of fire that scared men who'd never faced anything tougher than a bad hand of poker. Eleanor moved like someone who'd danced with pain more times than she'd danced with joy. Not proud of it, just resigned. The townsfolk watched her, same as they always did. A woman like her, wild-haired, sharp-eyed, with a split lip and a dress held together by sheer stubbornness, didn't blend into the background. But no one offered her a damn thing. No water, no kindness, just the same old whispers and the sound of doors clicking shut as she passed. The saloon boys had made their opinions clear the night before. She'd asked for work, not charity, but they'd seen something in her they wanted to break. It wasn't about desire. It was about proving that even the toughest spirit could be ground into dust under the right boot. She hadn't screamed when they dragged her behind the saloon, just stared at them with eyes like flint, silent as a grave. One of them, a rat-faced coward named Jed, had called her witch when she didn't give him the satisfaction of begging. Then they'd left her in the dirt, like a discarded bottle. Ribs aching pride, bruised, but not broken. Now, as the sun dipped low, she crouched behind the livery-stable fingers, gripping her knees so tight her knuckles turned white. The tears came. Then not the kind that shook your shoulders, but the quiet, angry kind that burned tracks down your cheeks. That's when she heard it, not the scrape of boots or the jeers of men, but the soft creak of a wagon wheel. An old man with a face like worn leather leaned over her, holding out a canteen. "Ain't much," he grunted, "but it's wet." Eleanor hesitated, then took it. The water tasted like rust and salvation. "They ain't worth spit, those boys," he muttered, nodding toward the saloon. "But you got the look of someone who ain't done fighting." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed the canteen back. "Fighting's all I know," she said. The old man chuckled dry as the wind. "Then you'll fit right in out here." For the first time in years, Eleanor Vance smiled. It wasn't pretty, but then again, nothing in Dry Gulch ever was. The footsteps came slow and deliberate, the kind of stride that belonged to a man who'd walked enough miles to know rushing never got you anywhere good. His shadow stretched long and lean across the hard-packed earth, and for a heartbeat, Eleanor's fingers curled around a jagged piece of flint, just in case. But when she looked up, the man standing there wasn't like the others. No swagger, no sneer, just a quiet presence like the land itself had shaped him. He held a dented tin cup in one hand, steam curling up from it like a promise. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that couldn't decide if they were gray or green, the color of a storm brewing, or one just passed. A scar ran down his jaw, pale and stark, the kind of mark that spoke of violence met and survived. But it was his silence that struck her. Not the empty kind, but the heavy knowing sort, like he'd seen enough to understand what words couldn't fix. "You're safe now," he said, voice rough but not unkind like a riverbed, worn smooth by time. Eleanor blinked. Safe wasn't a word that belonged in a place like Dry Gulch. Not after what she'd endured. She didn't reach for the cup at first, just stared at it like it might vanish if she moved too fast. The man didn't push. He set it down beside her, then shrugged out of his duster-faded leather lined with sheep's wool, the kind that had seen winters and wars, and laid it near her like an offering, not a demand. Then he turned to leave. "Wait." The words scraped out of her throat raw as the split on her lip. He stopped, looked back. "Why," she whispered. It was all she could manage. Why help her? Why risk the scorn of a town that thrived on cruelty? The man's gaze flicked to her hands, still clenched tight around the flint, then back to her face. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, softer than the wind through the sagebrush. Because someone should have. Something inside her cracked open, then not like a wound, but like a door left ajar in a dark room. She couldn't find her voice to answer, so she just nodded. He gestured toward the hills beyond town where the land rolled wild and untamed under a sky big enough to swallow regrets. "I've got a place out there," he said. "No conditions, no empty promises. Just a fact." Eleanor hesitated. She could still run. Keep heading south until her feet gave out or the desert took her. But her ribs ached, her boots were falling apart, and her soul well that had been dragging behind her for years. So she stood shaky as a newborn colt and draped his coat over her shoulders. The weight of it was strange, like armor she hadn't earned. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of sage underfoot and the distant cry of coyotes. The sky bled purple and gold, the first stars pricking through like holes in a lantern's shade. When they reached the cabin, small, sturdy with a porch light glowing like a beacon, she froze on the steps. Inside a fire crackled. A chair sat empty by the hearth. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Vance let herself believe that maybe not all roads had to end in dust and blood. The door creaked open, and for the first time in 6 years, Eleanor Vance didn't calculate the nearest exit. The man Ransom he'd called himself stepped aside without a word, but the way he stood there, hat in hand, shoulders relaxed like he had all the time in the world, and none of the usual intentions made something tight in her chest unclench just a fraction. The cabin smelled like honest work cedar smoke and slow-cooked venison, the kind of meal that took patience she hadn't known in years. Firelight licked at the rough-hewn walls, turning the pine planks gold where decades of hands had worn them smooth. A rocking chair still swayed slightly near the hearth, as if the ghost of its last occupant hadn't quite left. Eleanor hovered by the doorway, fingers twisting in the wool lining of his coat. Old habits died hard, she'd learned the hard way, that 4 walls usually meant trouble, that kindness was just cruelty waiting its turn. "You keep that door open wide as you need," Ransom said, not looking at her as he fed another log to the fire. His voice was easy, like he was commenting on the weather. "A door's meant to let folks come and go, not hold 'em." The night air curled in around her ankles, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. After a long moment, she nudged the door shut with her boot heel, but didn't latch it. She perched on the edge of a bench near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, but not so close that she couldn't bolt if needed. Ransom ladled stew into a chipped enamel bowl, the rich smell of juniper and wild onions making her stomach clench. He set it on the table between them, then retreated to the far side of the room like he was giving a spooked horse room to breathe. The first bite nearly undid her. Gamey venison tender as forgiveness with just enough salt to sting her split lip. She ate slow at first, then faster, the tin spoon scraping against the bowl like some long-forgotten prayer. Across the room, Ransom busied himself with a whetstone, and his knife the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the silence. When she finished, he took the bowl without comment and poured her weak black tea from a pot that had seen better days. They didn't speak much that night. Names were exchanged, his offered plain as a handshake. Hers whispered later when she thought he was asleep. "Eleanor." She'd breathed into the firelight, testing the weight of it after so long unheard. In the rocking chair, Ransom didn't stir, but the corner of his mouth might have twitched just for a heartbeat before she curled into the blankets he'd left near the hearth, the wool scratchy against her cheek, and smelling faintly of lye, soap, and man who didn't owe her a damn thing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the aspen leaves like dice in a gambler's hand. For the first time since she could remember, Eleanor closed her eyes without planning her next escape. Dawn crept in like a thief, painting the cabin in pale gold light. Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar comfort of warm floorboards beneath her, proof the fire had been tended through the night. The smell of strong coffee and wood smoke tangled in the air, and for one disorienting moment, she forgot where she was. Then she heard it, the steady, rhythmic chunk of an axe splitting wood outside. She found him shirt sleeves, rolled up past forearms, corded with the kind of muscle that came from honest labor, not vanity. Each swing of the axe was precise, effortless, like the tool was just another extension of his body. Eleanor watched through the window, noting how the morning light caught the sweat on his neck, how his breathing never changed even as the woodpile grew. A basin of clean water waited on the sideboard, a rough-hewn bar of lye soap beside it. She scrubbed her face until her skin burned, washing away the last traces of Dry Gulch's dust and dried blood. When she stepped onto the porch, bare feet whispering against the worn planks, Ransom didn't stop working, just nodded toward a stump where a peeled apple sat waiting. "Where were you heading?" he asked eventually, axe resting against his thigh. Eleanor chewed slowly, watching a hawk circle over the distant mesa. "Somewhere people ain't cruel," she said at last. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "You'll find fewer places than you'd hope." There was no pity in his voice, just the quiet certainty of a man who'd ridden enough miles to know the truth of things. Later, he produced a pair of boots too large but sturdy, and set them beside her without ceremony. She pulled them on, wincing as the leather brushed her scabbed toes, but said nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It had shape and weight like something living. Days passed in this strange, new rhythm. She gathered kindling while he repaired the corral. He cooked supper. She washed the tin plates. One evening, her fingers brushed the old saddle kept near the hearth, its leather worn smooth by generations of use. "Belonged to my father," Ransom said without looking up from his whittling. "Man once told me a saddle tells you everything about its rider." Eleanor traced a long scar in the leather. "And what's this one say about you?" For the first time, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not pain exactly, but the memory of it. "That I'm still here," he said, simply turning his attention back to the piece of wood in his hands. The nightmares came on the 7th night. She woke, gasping the phantom taste of whiskey and blood in her mouth, her hands clutching at blankets like they were saloon doors. Across the darkened cabin, she heard the creak of Ransom's chair as he stood, but he didn't approach, just waited a shadow by the window, giving her space to remember where she was. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl answered. Eleanor counted her breaths until they steadied, until the cabin's walls felt like shelter instead of a trap. Ransom never said a word. He didn't have to. The understanding between them was as solid as the axe handle he'd worn smooth with his hands. Some hurts ran too deep for words, but that didn't mean you had to bear them alone. Eleanor woke with a gasp, her body jerking upright like a marionette pulled taut. The firelight revealed Ransom already kneeling nearby, his hands carefully visible in the space between them. "Didn't touch you," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Just dreams." She pressed a trembling hand to her sternum, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. "You keep saying I'm safe," she whispered. "Like it's that simple." Ransom settled back on his heels, the firelight carving shadows into the lines of his face. "Don't say much that's simple," he replied. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Eleanor hugged her knees to her chest. "Used to think safety meant being invisible," she admitted to the flames. "Turns out that just makes it easier for folks to pretend you don't exist when they hurt you." Ransom nodded, stirring the embers with a poker. "Being seen's harder, but it's real." Her eyes traced the scar along his jaw, the way his hands bore the marks of a life lived hard, but not cruel. "You know," she said quietly. "Some. Why aren't you like the others?" The question hung between them, fragile as a spider's web. Ransom took his time answering. "Me never fixed a damn thing," he said at last. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Eleanor swallowed hard, voicing the fear that had gnawed at her since the first night. "You waiting for payment?" He turned then, his gaze steady as the North Star. "I'm waiting for you to stop feeling like you owe the world your pain." Something inside her fractured, not the sharp break of violence, but the slow thaw of ice giving way to spring. That night, for the first time in memory, she didn't sleep curled tight as a fist. She stretched out on the blankets, arms loose at her sides, listening to the creak of Ransom's rocking chair and the low, gravelly hum of an old hymn she thought she'd forgotten. Winter loosened its grip on the valley gradually, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes like a reluctant guest. Eleanor stood on the porch one crisp morning, wrapped in Ransom's wool shawl, watching sunlight turn the barn roof into a steaming silver platter. The cold didn't seep into her bones like it used to. The quiet didn't feel like loneliness anymore. Inside, Rannon stirred a pot of beans with one hand, while the other sketched quick, sure lines across a scrap of paper. Horses mostly, their powerful haunches the arch of their necks, but sometimes the jagged silhouette of the mesa at dusk. He glanced up, catching her watching. "You ever ride?" he asked suddenly. The question startled her. Memories surfaced, the smell of leather and mule sweat, the pride of handling a freight team, back when her hands were tough, and her spirit unbroken. "Been a while," she admitted. Ransom nodded toward the barn, where two horses stood hip-shot in the morning light. "Sun's warming the ground. Could use help checking the north fence line." Eleanor's breath caught. Not an order, not a demand, just an offer, plain as the boots he'd given her. She met his gaze and saw nothing there but quiet expectation, the kind that asked without taking. Her fingers tightened on the shawl. Then slowly, she nodded. Eleanor ran her fingers along the mare's neck, feeling the muscle twitch under warm hide. "I remember riding." She said the words, tasting of dust and younger days. Ransom just nodded his hands, busy with the gelding's bridle, giving her space to find her footing with the animal. The mare stood patient as Eleanor tightened the cinch, her hands remembering the old motions. No one rushed her. No one corrected the way she checked each hoof. The morning air carried the clean scent of snowmelt and pine as they rode out, the horse's breath puffing white in the cold. Eleanor's thighs burned with unfamiliar use, but the ache felt good proof she was more than just surviving. She stole glances at Ransom, how he moved with his horse, like they shared one heartbeat, his eyes always scanning the tree line, not out of fear, but awareness. They stopped, where the creek murmured under thinning ice, a brave cluster of violets pushing through the frozen earth. Eleanor slid from the saddle, her legs trembling as her boots met solid ground. She knelt by the flowers, their purple faces turned toward the weak sun. Ransom crouched beside her, close enough to share warmth, far enough to let her breathe. "They come every spring," he said. "First thing that dares." The question rose in her throat before she could stop it. "Why'd you stay in this valley most men would have ridden on?" Ransom plucked a dry blade of grass, rolling it between his fingers. "Quiet don't scare me," he said at last, "but losing hold of my own soul does." She looked up, then seeing the shadow cross his face, not guilt, but the solemn weight of choices made. She didn't press. Some truths were too heavy for daylight. That evening, Eleanor stirred the stew without being asked, her hands moving with purpose she hadn't felt in years. Ransom lingered in the doorway, watching the way firelight caught in her hair as she worked. When the meal was done, she didn't retreat to her usual corner, but stayed at the table, their elbows nearly touching. The scratch of Ransom's pencil filled the quiet. Curiosity drew Eleanor to peer over his shoulder. The sketch showed a woman standing beneath a pine, her hair wild, her stance rooted deep as the mountains. "That's not a horse," she whispered. Ransom didn't look up. "No." His thumb smudged a shadow along the paper. "That's what courage looks like when it stops running." A fist pounded on the door. Eleanor's body went rigid, the wooden spoon slipping from her fingers. Ransom rose slow, his hand brushing her shoulder just once before moving to the door. He opened it only wide enough to see who'd come calling at nightfall. The wind carried voices inside, sharp and insistent. One word cut through, clearer than the rest. "Bounty." The knock came like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Eleanor's spine went rigid, her fingers freezing mid-motion over Ransom's sketchbook. Through the door's crack, she caught a glimpse of tobacco-stained teeth and a familiar, cruel jaw. Lowe, one of the men who'd watched her get dragged through the saloon's back alley without lifting a finger. "Evenin'." Lowe drawled his voice like gravel in a tin can. "Heard you been keeping company with that Vance girl." His eyes flicked past Ransom, searching the cabin's shadows. "Figured she might want to come home. No hard feelin's." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Ransom stepped outside, shutting the door with a quiet click that sounded louder than a slam. She crept to the window, watching through the warped glass as Ransom's posture went still as a mountain ridge. Lowe shifted from foot to foot, his sneer fading when Ransom took one deliberate step forward. Words were exchanged too low to hear, but she saw the exact moment Lowe's bravado cracked. He spat into the snow like a petulant child before slinking back into the darkness. When Ransom returned, the cold air clinging to his coat, Eleanor stood waiting. "What did you say to him?" Her voice came out tighter than she intended. Ransom hung his hat slowly before meeting her gaze. "Told him if he ever looked your way again, I'd dig a hole so deep even the devil wouldn't find his bones." Her throat worked. "Would you—" A beat of silence, then softer than she expected. "Yes." Something shifted between them. Then, not the fragile truce of before, but something deeper, like the first green shoot breaking through frozen ground. That night she didn't sleep by the hearth. She sat beside him on the porch, their shoulders nearly touching, watching the stars blink awake one by one. After a while, her fingers found his, not clutching, not claiming, just resting there like they'd finally come home. Ransom didn't pull away, didn't tighten his grip, just let her anchor herself to him as an owl called from the pines. "You don't owe me a damn thing, Eleanor," he said at last, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite emotion, but wasn't not emotion either. She studied their joined hands, his scarred and work-worn, hers finally losing their defensive curl. "I know," she murmured. "But maybe I want to give you something anyway." His breath hitched just once. "Like what?" "Don't know yet." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the wool of his coat scratchy against her cheek. "Something that matters." The night held its breath around them. For the first time in her 26 years, the world didn't feel like a thief, waiting to steal what little she had. It felt like dawn breaking over a field after a long winter, slow, inevitable, and full of quiet promise. Spring came lazy that year, the snow retreating in fits and starts. Eleanor left the door open during daylight, now letting the breeze carry in the scent of damp earth and new growth. She swept the cabin floor more than necessary, the rhythmic swish of the broom keeping time with the steady beat of her heart, no longer braced for impact, but learning slowly how to simply be. Eleanor noticed the way Ransom watched her sometimes, not with expectation, but with a quiet sort of wonder, like a man who'd spent too long in the dark, finally remembering what sunlight looked like. His silences had become a language of their own, each pause carrying more weight than most men's speeches. One morning she found the dress folded beside her wash basin, soft blue cotton that smelled of cedar and lye soap, with no note to mark its giving. That evening she wore it without ceremony, the fabric brushing against skin that had known too much roughness, and not nearly enough tenderness. Ransom said nothing when he saw her, just held her gaze a heartbeat longer than necessary before offering her the first taste of that night's stew. She'd watched him carving by firelight for weeks now, his big hands moving with uncommon delicacy over wood and leather. 3 trips to town each time, returning with something tucked away, a sliver of silver, a strip of crimson-dyed hide. She never asked, but her pulse quickened every time his knife flashed in the firelight. When he asked her to walk with him that golden afternoon, she knew. The violets had multiplied since their first visit, spreading across the creek bank like a purple promise. Ransom removed his hat with uncharacteristic formality, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. "Never figured I'd ask this of anyone," he said, his voice rough as tree bark. "But if I don't ask now, I'll regret it every spring that comes after." The ring caught the sunlight, a simple braided band of silver and bone, worn smooth as a river stone. "Ain't much to offer," he continued, "and you don't owe me yes. But if you'd allow it, I'd like to give you a name that don't carry shame. A home that's yours by choice, the world tilted on its axis. Not the sickening lurch of danger, but the dizzying spin of something too good to be true. No one had ever asked Eleanor anything they'd demanded taken assumed. Yet here stood this quiet man offering her a future with hands that shook like aspen leaves, his eyes holding more vulnerability than she'd ever seen in any gunfighter's stare. She meant to say yes. The word lodged in her throat dissolved into something between a laugh and a sob. So she nodded instead, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. And when she finally whispered yes, it sounded less like an answer and more like a prayer. Ransom folded her into his arms, then not hushing her tears, not pretending they didn't exist, just holding space for all the years she'd spent swallowing them back. The next morning, old Widow Macready came down from the North Ridge with a bundle of lace and blackberry tea, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she took in Eleanor's blue dress and the new light in Ransom's eyes. She didn't remark on either, just pressed the gifts into Eleanor's hands and muttered something about needing help with her sheep. Come shearing season, the closest thing to welcome either of them would ever get in this valley. The morning of the wedding, Widow Macready arrived at dawn with a bone comb and a jar of rose-hip salve. She said nothing about the blue dress now pressed smooth, nothing about the way Eleanor's hands trembled as she braided her own hair. Just pressed a heel of fresh bread into her palms and muttered, "Eat, girl. Ain't no romance in an empty stomach." They married on the porch as the sun dipped toward the western ridge. No preacher, no fuss, just Ransom in a clean shirt, with his hair still damp from the creek, and Eleanor barefoot with violets woven through her braid. The old widow stood witness, her gnarled hands clutching her apron, when Ransom spoke his vows like a man building something meant to last. Eleanor's answer came softer, the words tasting strange and sweet on her tongue after years of bitter ones. When the widow thrust a loaf of honey cake into their hands and hurried away, sniffling, the valley seemed to pause. The jays quieted in the pines, the creek hushed its chatter. Then thunder rolled in from the distant peaks, slow and certain as a promise. The rain came, sudden fat drops, splattering the thirsty earth. Eleanor stepped off the porch into the downpour, her bare feet sinking into suddenly soft soil. The water plastered her dress to her skin, turned her braid dark as river stone. And when she laughed, a sound so bright it startled the ravens from the barn roof. Ransom finally moved. He met her in the middle of the yard, rain streaming down his face like the land itself was weeping for joy. Eleanor reached for him first, her kiss tentative as the first green shoot of spring. Ransom answered with the reverence of a man touching something holy, his hands framing her face like she might disappear if he held too tight or not tight enough. Lightning split the sky. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes sang to the storm. But here, in this muddy patch of earth that had known too much sorrow, they swayed together, not quite dancing, not quite standing still, while the rain washed away the last ghosts of what they'd been before. Back in the cabin, the fire had burned low. Neither noticed. They'd become their own warmth, their own light against the gathering dark. And as night settled over the valley, the glow from their windows shone steady against the storm. Not a fortress, not an escape, but something far more rare, a home earned, not stolen. A love given, not taken. So tell me, friends watching from cities and plains and far-flung towns, have you ever known a love that grew slow as oak roots and strong as mountain stone? Leave a word for Eleanor in the comments, or for the quiet men who build their love with calloused hands and patient hearts. And if this story settled in your bones like an old song half remembered well, there's always another tale waiting down the trail. The West wasn't won in a day, and these stories ain't told in one sitting. The next chapter's coming soon,